Evening. As we open this New York 1960 closed class, let us go back in thought for a moment to the basic mystical principle of this message of the infinite way. My conscious oneness with God constitutes my oneness with all spiritual being and idea. As you know, we are taught that nothing happens in our experience except through our consciousness. What we are not conscious of isn't taking place in our experience. It may be taking place in the experience of the person next to us, but it is not taking place in our experience unless it touches our consciousness and something within us responds to it. I have illustrated that for you in this way, that as people walk down the street, there are those who will turn and look at every jewelry shop they pass. And there are others who will turn and look at every department store window. And others will turn and look at every gadget store. And the person who's looking in the clothing shop very often isn't even aware that there is a jewelry shop on the street. And the person who's interested in those electric gadgets doesn't really know that they've passed the clothing shop. In other words, we know only what touches our consciousness and what we respond to. There are lots of things that come to the attention of our eyes and our ears of which we never become aware. We just never see them or hear them, because there is nothing in us that responds to them. It is in this same way that, oh, well, you have heard this many, many times, I'm sure, and perhaps it's happened to you. This came in a letter this week. A lady writes that someone brought to her attention a copy of one of the Infinite Way books, and immediately she knew that this was her message, and this is what she had been waiting for all of her life. And of course it was entirely new to her, entirely strange. And the next day when she was in one of the rooms of her home, she picked up a book, and it was The Art of Meditation by Goldsmith, and she remembered she had read it, what seems to her, it must have been 10 years ago, but it had no interest for her. And that's exactly what I mean when I say that nothing can take place in your experience except that which you become consciously conscious of. Everything else goes by. We have had many, many people who have had copies of our writings and have given them to neighbors. And the neighbors have become very good students, while the one who gave them the book has forgotten that they ever owned it. And all of this only confirms the fact that nothing becomes real to you except that which first of all comes to your consciousness, and secondly brings forth a response from within you. Well, then, those who have been led to a mystical nature will naturally respond to mystical principles. And here, too, these principles must be presented to them so as to touch their consciousness, but on the other hand, they will do nothing for them unless there is a response within them that says, ah, yes. And you watch how this happens. Now, in the human life, regardless of what it is, we think of and we know ways of attaining it through external activity, through work or through advertising or through taking thought or through friendships and so forth and so on. But after one has come to the mystical path, one does not use the weapons of the world. One then has recourse to entirely different principles of life and principles of living. And the foundational principle of the mystical life is that in making contact with the source of life, we have access to every form of life. Now, it doesn't mean that we can outline what we want and then go to the source and get it. It doesn't mean that at all. That can be done on the mental level of life, but not on the mystical. On the mystical level, you have to abandon your desires, your wishes, because life has its foundation in not my will, but thine be done, or I know not how to pray or what to pray for. Rather, let thy spirit bear intercession with my spirit, and then, of course, the fruitage will follow. In other words, let us assume that this is a moment of prayer in our lives. And up to this moment, our lives have fallen into certain molds, certain activities, certain obligations. And whether or not this is the will of God, or let us put it this way, even if this is not the will of God, it will go on forever unless some accident changes it, unless there is an absolute change of consciousness. In other words, a person may be in a work for which they're totally unfitted, and unless there is some unusual or accidental circumstance, they may have to spend their entire lifetime in uncongenial work, unless by a change of consciousness they find the way to reach the source of their being. When they do, they will soon find that normal and natural ways will open for them to make a transition into something congenial to their nature. Now let us say that we have come to a moment of prayer, and that actually we would like our lives to be God-governed. We would like to enter a phase of life in which we actually know that it was God that ordained it. Not the will of our parents, not the accident of having to do something at a time in our life because of circumstances, but rather we would like to feel that the time has come when I would like to be certain that God governs my life, that God ordains every act, that God feeds it, sustains it, maintains it. Now you can see that the preparation for this moment of prayer will have to be the setting aside of all personal desires. And let it be clearly understood that for many people this is an impossibility, because where their ego is concerned, they will find it a very difficult thing to set aside that which they themselves have determined is to be their way, their path. Also, another question comes up, that according to the human scene, it may be necessary for an income to come in to maintain the present situation, and therefore it seems almost impossible to say, I don't mind what happens economically as long as the change is made from living humanly to living spiritually, because it can entail an interval of economic discord, economic upset, economic lack and limitation. It has happened that way many, many times, that students, in making the transition from their human life, have found that an interval takes place in which there is strife and struggle, and it is in that interval that quite a few lose their demonstration, because they feel they just cannot take this period of lack, or the what seems like having our neighbors criticize us because we aren't as prosperous as they think we ought to be, or sometimes as we think we ought to be. But we here, we know that if we could have a wish, it would be that our lives no longer be governed by circumstances or conditions, no longer be governed by families, friends, opinions, human will, or even human need, but that our lives would be God-governed, so that we could take advantage of that passage of the marriage ceremony and say, I'm sure that whatever God joins me to, whatever God unites me with, this would be an eternal, immortal relationship, and one of infinite abundance, harmony, grace, and peace. And therefore, my only desire is God's grace, that God's grace may govern my experience. Now, there is a way to achieve that. There is a mystical way to achieve it. And first, it must be recognized that every individual on the face of the globe originally was destined to fulfill a part of God's plan. Every individual. Nobody ever was intended to earn their living by the sweat of their brow. Nobody ever was intended, under the will of God, to labor for their supply. Originally, everyone is born, is destined into a life of spiritual activity, translated into some form of human activity, but nevertheless spiritual and under the guidance and direction and support and government of the divine will, the divine intelligence, the divine love. That is our original destiny. Now, all of us have violated that. The very moment that we went to work at anything at all because we had to make a living, we violated our spiritual destiny. The very moment we married for any other reason under the sun than to glorify God, we violated our spiritual destiny. It comes as a surprise many times to women to know that marrying to have a home or family isn't spiritual. But that marriage, when it is spiritual, always results in a home and probably a family, but the motive of it is the wrong motive. That is, again, like the motive of wanting to be a practitioner, which is wrong, but being a practitioner is very right. Now, think of this. This is a moment of prayer, and we are acknowledging that it is possible that the place I'm occupying in life may not be mine by divine right, by the will of God, the mind of God, the love of God, that what I am doing may not be under God's grace. And surely if it isn't successful, we can be sure it isn't under God's grace, because whatever is under God's grace is not only successful, but joyous, peaceful, serene, positive. And so it is, we are retiring into the secret place of the Most High, into the inner sanctuary. And there we are surrendering ourselves. Not my will, but thine be done. I have only one will, and that is to do the will of my Father. I have only one will, and that is to live and move and have my being in God's grace, under God's grace, in God's hand. I have only one will, to do those things that the Father gives me to do, to be in those places where the Father wills me to be. And now I consciously bring myself into oneness with God by surrendering my personal desires, my personal hopes, my personal ambitions. I drop all of these outside the temple doors like the Orientals drop their shoes before they enter the temple. And that dropping of the shoes outside is, of course, symbolic of dropping our burdens, our dirt, our uncleanness, our heaviness, our anything, so that we come into the presence of God naked. And taking off the shoes is symbolic of that nakedness, just like coming into the Christian church and removing one's hat is also a symbol. Remember that originally the hat, the hood, was a protective apparel. It was usually made of steel, and its nature was protective. But coming into the presence of God, we take off our protection We come in without armor or armament. We come naked, naked of desire, naked of fear, and submit ourselves to the Father within me. Thy will be done in me. Thy will be done as me. Thy will be done through me. Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth, and I will do those things given me to do. And in this surrender, we are uniting with God. I and my Father are one. Where God is, I am. Wherever I am, God is. If I mount up to heaven, if I make my bed in hell, if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the place whereon I stand is holy ground. I and the Father are here. And I do those things that I see the Father give me to do. I bear witness to God's glory. This is God's universe. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. And because of this, I am but an instrument, a servant of God, about my Father's business, able and willing to do thy will. For thy grace is my sufficiency in all things. Thy grace as manifested in thy will. Thy grace as manifested by thy love. Thy grace as manifested by thy wisdom. Thy grace is my sufficiency in all things. Now, in this moment of prayer, remember that there is nothing in the external world that you desire. There is nothing in the external world that you are seeking. There is nothing in the external world that is attracting you. You are now in the secret place of the Most High, and you are seeking your good within you. I and my Father are one. Son, thou art ever with me, all that I have is thine, and so I am here in this holy temple, in this inner sanctuary of my own being, desiring to bring forth God's grace. And as it comes, remember, I am to share it. It never comes for the purpose of glorifying me. It never comes for the purpose of benefiting me. It comes as God's grace to show forth God's glory. Let's not forget this important point now. God's grace is not going to do something for you to make you important. It is not going to do something for you to give you fame or fortune. Whatever of God's grace functions in you will be to show forth God's glory. We dare never forget that whatever it is that has come to us by the grace of God is to show forth God's glory. Every time you look at a fruit tree or berry bush laden down with fruit of berries, remember that isn't there for you. That is there to show forth God's glory. You may use it, but you may not take credit for it. It is there to show forth God's glory. And when you look at the beautiful scenery and the beautiful sunsets, please remember that the object of them is to show forth God's glory. The heavens declare the glory of God. The earth showeth forth his handiwork. And we too were created for one purpose and one purpose only, to show forth God's glory. Whatever it is that we become in the spiritual world and on the spiritual path is an evidence of God's glory. This is his handiwork. And when we see a Jesus or a John, when we see a Buddha or a Lao Tzu, please remember, we are witnessing God's glory made evident on earth. So it is when we witness the great inventions, the great discoveries. Remember that you are bearing witness to God's glory. It is God that has the secret of the atom. It is God who has the secret of electricity. It is God who has the secret of electronics. It is God who has the secrets of nature. And everything that we bring forth from the inner world, we bring forth as glory to God. Now, while you're here in this silence, in this moment of prayer, you not only stay relaxed, but regardless of any thing or person in the external world that tries to tempt you to an attachment, to a desire, reject it with a realization, all that the Father hath is mine. All my good cometh forth from the Father. And with these roses there are no thorns. With this good that comes through from God, there are no problems, there are no regrets. There is only the eternal joy of realization. That which God has given to me is forever. That which God giveth to me is immortal and eternal. Our relationship is immortal and eternal, for that which God hath joined together no man can put asunder. God's will is infinite. God's intelligence is infinite. God's love is infinite. God's power is infinite. And beside God, there is no other. And so we abide in this moment of prayer in an inner stillness, knowing that our oneness with God in the silence constitutes our oneness with our spiritual good. Since God is infinite, God constitutes all forms of good. Therefore, being one with God, we are one with all forms of good. That which unfolds to me from within, I am free to share because it is infinite and it is infinitely manifested. In other words, the more I use, the more I have. The more I give, the more I share, the more I have. because of the infinite source from which it comes. In our moment of prayer, you can see now how impossible it is to do what we call mental work, to get something, acquire something, achieve something. You can see now how impossible it is in this moment of prayer to want anything or need anything external to what is now at this moment unfolding within us. All that the Father has is unfolding within us. All that the Father hath is established within us. And my oneness in this moment of prayer, my oneness with God, is my oneness with an infinity of spiritual good. What could I want besides this? As we come out from our moment of prayer, we take up our work where we left off, and we continue doing those things which are normal and natural for us to do in our present situation. If it is housekeeping, it is housekeeping. If it is bookkeeping, it is bookkeeping. But whatever it is, we keep right on doing it. We keep right on fulfilling the work that is now ours to do until such time as we may, by the grace of God, be moved into some other activity, some other mode of life, some other place of living. But none of this do we do by our will. None of this do we attempt of our own volition. We have our moments of prayer in which we drop all outward desires and live only for the joy of inner unfoldment, and then in due time it begins to mold our lives in the direction in which our lives spiritually should be. It opens to us the ways in which we are to go, or it closes doors which are no longer meant for our expression. But over and over, throughout the day, there will be the conscious reminder that it is my conscious oneness with God, my conscious union with God, that constitutes my oneness with all that is to unfold throughout eternity, in this life and whatever lives may come hereafter. All of this is attained only by virtue of my conscious oneness with God, because in this conscious oneness with God, God's grace operates. God's grace cannot operate while we have it operates, but not in our experience. God's grace does not function for us while we have a will of our own or a desire of our own that we want God to fulfill. It does not work in that way. God's grace operates for God's glory. God's grace operates to show forth God's glory. God's grace operates to show forth God's infinite nature, God's infinite abundance, the wisdom of God, the love of God, the eternal life of God. And therefore, to benefit by God's grace, we must be sure that our only desire is to know him aright, to be consciously one with God. We lose the benefit of spiritual living in the moment that we attempt to have God do our will, or gratify our desire, or fulfill our wish. That is the barrier to spiritual demonstration. For the creature is not under the law of God, neither indeed can be, and God does not fulfill the desires or the will of man whose breath is in his nostril. We have to be children of God in order to be heirs of God. We have to be children of God in order to live by God's grace. And to be children of God means to be without personal wish, will, desire, ambition. And that, of course, must not be misconstrued. That doesn't mean that we do not wish to know love, harmony, joy, beauty, peace. Of course we do. But we not only wish that for ourselves, we wish it for our neighbors, and more especially for our enemy neighbors. And so it is that this is not to be confused with the idea of attempting to have God do our will. It is perfectly right to desire to see harmony on the face of the earth, peace on the face of the earth, joy and beauty on the face of the earth. But let us realize this, that it must come as the grace of God, in God's way, and to fulfill God's plan and not the plan of men. The presence of God and the power of God can never be used to satisfy men's desires, wishes, ambitions, hopes, or plans. But God's grace can be made available to any and every individual who wishes it to come forth, that it may show forth God's glory, God's graciousness, God's love, God's plan for this world. I know, of course, that many of you already know that there could not be a universe without there being an infinite intelligence and a divine love as the source of the universe. Therefore, you must know that there is a divine plan for the world. And no man can put asunder that plan. It is for this reason that as human consciousness is evolving toward the higher plane and toward the day of God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven, that there should be a breaking up. And I'm sure you will realize that the conditions that are taking place on earth today, which are disturbing so many people, are not really evil conditions, but rather they are the breaking up of evil conditions which have heretofore existed. These things that are taking place on earth today are not evil. They are the breaking up of the evils that men have brought on the earth for many, many centuries. The evils of one race dominating another race, the evils of one race profiting from another race, the evils of one race subjugating another race, the evils of religion, the evils of religious domination, the evils of the religious battles that take place between members of the same religion. These are evils, but these are the evils that are breaking up. And all of this that is in the earth today is a breaking up of these evils. As we travel, we note that whereas the outer appearances still testify to churches fighting each other, churches disagreeing with each other, churches competing with each other, that underneath there is another movement, a movement of unity, a movement of understanding, a movement toward an ultimate peace on earth. It will never result in there being only one church on earth, because there are too many states and stages of consciousness, and each stage and state of consciousness must be fulfilled. Therefore, there must always be some people who must worship in one way and others who will worship in another way. But there could be 10,000 different religions, and yet there could be peace on earth as long as each one of the religions acknowledged that there is only one God. And that is the day that right now is coming closer. The day when the churches will all acknowledge there is only one God. In the past, they have never done that. They have merely said there is one God, but we have it. But the day is coming, and we see it and hear it in the church world as we travel, that it is being acknowledged that there is only one God, whether you are in this particular church or that particular church, or whether you are worshiping on your knees or on your feet, or whether you are worshiping sitting down. You still are worshiping the one God. And you see that when that acknowledgement is universally made, there will never again be a reason for a war. In all the history of the world, there have only been two reasons for wars. One is church, and the other is business. Church or business has instigated every war that has ever been fought on the face of the globe. And the time is here now when business won't do it anymore, because business is being negotiated by committees, national and international, and the business world is recognizing the fact that the best kind of competition is settled at the table of negotiation. And so business eventually will not be a reason. It was only business that gave us World War I and World War II. There was nothing else but business. There was nothing else involved. There were never any questions of democracy or Christianity. Those were merely the advertising blinds that were put over people's eyes. But the truth was that business was the reason for those wars. And that is the reason that so much attention is being given now to forming the 6 and the 7, and eventually it'll be 11, I'm sure. Now, with business out of the way as a cause of war, we have only religion. And that will be out of the way when the acknowledgement is made There is but one God, whether you worship that God in this temple or that, or in none. Even if you worship in your home or in your automobile or walking on the street, it must still be the one, because there is but one God, and nobody has him, and nobody owns him, and nobody has ever embraced him in an edifice, in a code, or in dogma, ritual, theology. No one has ever captured God. God remains free, independent, one. And the reason is that God can't be found, for his kingdom is within you. If it was outside somewhere, I'm sure someone would have captured him and had him all tied up with ribbons. But God can't be captured because God can't be found. God is within you. God is not in an edifice. God is not in a church. God is not in a teaching. God is neither low here nor low there. God is within you. And God is just as much within you if you are a Jew or a Protestant or a Catholic or a Vedantist. God is still within you. And it is still the same one God. Now, the answer to prayer will come when we stop praying to that God for what we want, what we need, what we think we ought to have, and when we pray the prayer of, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. My will is to do thy will. My way is to follow thy way. My love is to let thy love flow through me. My wisdom is to be thy wisdom expressed through me. And thy grace is to be my sufficiency, thy grace. And I don't care now whether it is a Hebrew talking to his Hebrew God within him, a Protestant, a Catholic, or any other faith, the Muslim. As long as an individual can say, thy grace is my sufficiency, we are all speaking to the same Father within us, and that Father will answer us regardless of what our religion may be, or even if we do not profess one, because the Father has no knowledge whatsoever of religions or churches. They are as far outside of his realm as the battlefield. They do not come within the comprehension of his mind. God takes no cognizance of edifices, boundaries, colors, creeds. God is love, but God is universal love in the midst of you. God is life, but God is universal life in the midst of you. God is intelligence, but God is intelligence in the midst of you. And be assured that that life, that intelligence, and that love knows nothing about religions, creeds, political parties, or boundary lines. The love of God, the wisdom of God is available to any man, any woman, any child who in humility turns within themselves to the secret place within themselves and realizes, thy will be done, And thy grace is my sufficiency. For that thy that I am talking to is the infinite divine selfhood, which is the selfhood of all men, women, children, animals, vegetables, the life of all being, whether it's called animate or inanimate, human or animal. There is but one life. We who are of what is called the human species, we are enabled consciously to know him aright, and to know him as our life, as our intelligence, as our love, and put no labels on that him, on the source of our grace. You know this far better after you have been in an active spiritual practice, healing practice, for a number of years, and discover that your treatments not only heal Jews and Gentiles and Muslims and Hindus, but you'll be surprised they heal the sinners just as well as they do the saints. For God's grace, God's rain falls on the just and the unjust. It's just as easy for a sinner to be healed as it is for a saint. And there's no distinctions made in color, race, creed, nation. And you learn this when you start giving treatments, when you start prayer work, and discover that anyone at all who makes themselves receptive to your prayers responds to it, and that those who do not make themselves receptive do not respond to it, even if they're saints or even if they're so-called Christians. In other words, it hasn't to do with their faith or color or creed. It has to do with their receptivity to the love of God. So it is then, by being one with God, we are one with our good. And instantly we are freed of the responsibility of taking anxious thought for what we shall eat or what we shall drink or wherewithal we shall be clothed. We are instantly freed of taking anxious thought for our health, because all these things will adjust themselves as we realize that thy grace being my sufficiency, my oneness with thee constitutes the health of my countenance, my safety, and my security. Above all of this, in this moment of prayer, something takes place. If you do not experience it, those of you who are just young, new, starting on this path, if you do not experience it in your first or second or third or fifth moment of prayer, do not become discouraged. Always remember that there has been a sense of separation between us and God. And like the prodigal son who wandered far from his father's house, it may take a little while to get back into the father's house. And therefore, be patient. And ultimately, you will feel when you have made the contact within you that you have made it. When the Father is there consciously, you will in some way receive the assurance of that presence. That was why the Master could speak as he did when he said, I will never leave thee, or I will be with thee to the end of the world. What was actually happening there was he was revealing to the world that which was being said within him. That was what he was hearing within him. I will never leave you, Jesus. I will be with you, Jesus, to the end of the world. I will be your bread and your wine and your water. And then Jesus was revealing to us that this I was at the center of our being, and that was what made him our way shower. He was showing us the way back to the I that is within us, to the presence of God within us. And therefore, you will eventually either hear the words or receive the assurance that there is a presence within you that goes before you to make the crooked places straight. This presence that is within you goes to prepare mansions for you. This presence that is within you establishes you in your spiritual identity, in your spiritual activity, in your rightful place, in your rightful recognition. It does that. He performeth that which is given me to do. But on this mystical path, the goal is coming to that place where you receive this assurance from within you. At first you read it in books and you hear it through the lips of teachers, but eventually, if you are to follow the mystical path, you yourself must receive the assurance from within yourself. Be not afraid. It is I. Be not afraid. I am with you. Be not afraid. I will never leave you. Fear not. Fear not. I am with you. And you have not completed your mission until you have attained the mystical estate which enables you to receive the assurance from within yourself. This is the activity of a healing practice. A practitioner receives an assurance when asked for help from within that all is well, even if the physical senses do not testify to it, even if the appearances do not testify to it. The practitioner continues the work until an inner assurance comes. Fear not, I am on the field, or all is well, this is my beloved child. Some kind of an assurance comes from within that there is a God. And the moment that assurance comes, the practitioner's work is done. In case the patient next day hasn't responded, hasn't improved, or hasn't been entirely healed, the practitioner probably goes through the same process again and receives another assurance. There are some cases that do not readily yield, and the practitioner may continue work for a year. But always what the practitioner is seeking is an assurance from within that God is on the field. And when the practitioner receives that, their work for that moment is complete. The only reason that all healings are not quick healings or instantaneous healings is that there are conditions present in the patient's consciousness that must yield before the healing can be made evident. The patient doesn't know what it is, or they would respond and change their thought instantly. But within each one of us, remember, there is some resistance to truth. Within each one of us is a self-will, that my will be done. Not so much concern about God's, but just be sure it happens this way and this time. And that within us is itself a barrier, or the desire that a healing or demonstration take place in the way in which we expect it, and so forth and so on. And therefore, there are many of us who carry problems for long, long times and wonder why they're not met. Always when they are met, we realize that something has yielded in our consciousness that made it possible for the healing to be made manifest. But from the practitioner's standpoint, the practitioner's work consists of attaining that inner assurance that God is on the field. And this has been our moment of prayer. Thank you.